throughout Ohio State's quarterback competition, Ryan Day has sort of, I don't know if you would say flippantly, just kind of floated it out there. Well, maybe they both play to start the year. Maybe we play two quarterbacks. Maybe McCord and Devin Brown could both play against Indiana. And we've always kind of thought, well, that's clearly not what he wants to do. Like, that's the last thing they're going to do, right? Still talking about it on August 21st. Monday, as we're standing here outside the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. Ohio State less than 2 weeks away from that opener against Indiana. Steven, do you think Ohio State should play two quarterbacks if they don't have a defined starter at the end of this competition?
I hate the way you worded that question. I don't think they should play two quarterbacks. I think they should pick one quarterback. Under the guise of which you asked the question, sure. The schedule kind of...
What other guys is there? That's...
It's a type of schedule where you're not worried about losing the game. So you can find some stuff out. You can find in a game where they're live and they can get hit, can they move the ball up and down the field? Because it's not about the score. It's not. It's about what that does, what they do in those games, and how it maybe translates when you play somebody where the score does matter. And so when I asked that question, I started looking up other teams who have purposefully played two quarterbacks, because things he brought up Duggan. I think their starting quarterback got hurt, which put Duggan into the starting lineup in the first place. That's not purposeful. Purposeful was what Michigan did the last 2 years, where last year was kind of back and forth, and the year before that they made sure J.J. McCarthy had a role to the point that he was making plays in the Ohio State-Michigan game. Purposefully is 2018 Clemson going back and forth between Kelly Bryant and Trevor Lawrence for the first 4 games of the season before giving Trevor Lawrence the job, and he ends up winning a national championship, so it worked for them. Purposefully is 2015, and we all know how that went for Ohio State, going back and forth between J.T. Baird and Cardale Jones. So we've seen a lot of examples of purposely doing it, but then also accidentally. The purposeful ones are the ones I'm interested in, because when you do it on purpose, where you spend those first 4 games, especially now where you can play 4 games and still redshirt, and that's where you see a lot of guys transfer up to that 4 games, where has it worked and where has it not, and is it worth doing it for Ohio State when you have a quarterback room like this?
And that 4-game thing isn't quite the same as it used to be, because there's transfer portal windows now that you have to. So it's a different scenario. And 2015 is one example, and there's some other examples of times where there's a clear, a clear style difference between the quarterbacks. And I know people have talked about Devin Brown's maneuverability and all that stuff. He's not that different than Kyle McCord. They are very similar to each other. Devin Brown is much more like Kyle McCord than he is like JT Barrett or Justin Fields or someone like that. Like, he's not that crazy out there into like dual threat territory. So when it's two guys who are that similar, do you think there's a drawback, Andrew, to going into the starting game of the season, especially when you're favored by 4 touchdowns, and letting them, like, continuing the competition there, because you just don't feel like what you've done on the practice field has decided the competition?
Yeah, that's I've been kind of wrestling with this for the last hour or so since Ryan talked. It's not ideal. I sent this. We had a text subscriber get the text. We had a text subscriber text in that they were pretty panicked about this whole situation at this point, that they were like, all right, guys, like, I'm in an 8, a 9, or a 10 right now. Like, this is not good. And I responded to everybody, but I sent out a text like, it's not ideal. It's not the situation you would have wanted. It's not the situation that I don't think we would have said a week ago, a couple of days ago. It's not what you would prefer, but it's not the end of the world if you have to start 2. Where I would get nervous is if you get out of the Indiana game and you're like, all right, we're going to do 2 again against Youngstown State. It worked against Indiana. We're going to do it again. Then I would start to get nervous. At some point, you've got to make it. You've got to make a guy the starting quarterback. You've got to have an answer. You've got to have a number 1. So it's not ideal. I wouldn't do it. I would go with one guy, but I do see the merits of it because, like Steven said, you're going to win these 3 games unless something absolutely catastrophic happens. So you're going to win these 3 games. So you have the ability to toy around a little bit, because what happens if, let's say, you start Devin Brown? You start Devin Brown against Indiana, and he doesn't play that well, and now all of a sudden you're like, oh, what do we do? We got to play Youngstown State. Like, what do we do? Then you go into the next 2 games where you're a little bit unsure, and then you got to go to Notre Dame. Then you're in a pickle. So it's not the greatest situation in the world, but I don't think the sky is falling with this.
I will say this. If they play both against Indiana and he commits and says to us going in, if he will, we're playing both against Indiana, Kyle McCord starts that game. I think he absolutely starts Kyle McCord in that game. And then Devin Brown is the guy. Because the other thing he said today was like, hey, you could plan to play both, and then one guy plays so great that you just keep him in, and now that's your quarterback. And I guess the reason I've never been that opposed to it, I thought what Michigan did last year worked and was smart. It was a different scenario because you had an incumbent, and as Steven was talked about, the second guy who was kind of, J.J. McCarthy was sort of like a package guy, but you knew he was coming. You knew he was a highly ranked guy, a talented guy, and you could give them both a game to start against relatively even competition and then make an assessment after that. And I didn't think that would necessarily work for Ohio State for a few reasons. They don't have an incumbent, and they are opening with a conference game on the road, and I know they're favored by a lot, but I usually don't mess around with that. The thing that Ryan Day keeps bringing up, though, is not a fear. He never talks about we need to get a guy in place because he needs to get a rapport with the receivers. He needs to work with his new starting center. He needs to get this vibe together. He keeps saying it's great that we've been able to split them all up and get them the most reps, because for him it is all about getting the best performance out of the quarterback. And he says that the end result is just whatever it takes to get OSU to win. So I don't think I have a problem with them playing 2 in the first game as long as it is based on a plan like that. It's a continued assessment. And I think, Andrew, you're right that it can't go on indefinitely. At some point, I think you have to commit one way or the other. I don't know if you can split, especially because they are essentially the same identity as players, more or less. But I think the games would be like the final deciding factor. Like finally going up against an unfamiliar defense and a defense that has been game planning for you in a way that Jim Knowles doesn't when they do scrimmage stuff. I think that would give them the information they need. But they also could decide someone before then. Just because they haven't picked one today doesn't mean they won't have one in place by next Monday when they start their true game prep for Indiana. A lot more talk about this on Buckeye Talk, and get the text 614-350-3315.